Our reading is from Mark. We are in the 3rd chapter. Jesus entered a house. A crowd gathered again, so that it was impossible for him and his followers even to eat. When his family heard what was happening, they came to take control of him. They were saying, "He's out of his mind." The legal experts came down from Jerusalem. Over and over, they charged, "He's possessed by Beelzebul. He has thrown out demons with the authority of the ruler of demons." When Jesus called them together, he spoke to them in a parable. "How can Satan throw Satan out? A kingdom involved in civil war will collapse, and a house torn apart by divisions will collapse. If Satan rebels against himself and is divided, then he can't endure. He's done for. No one gets into a house of a strong person and steals anything without first tying up the strong person. Only then can the house be burglarized. I assure you that human beings will be forgiven for everything, for all sins and insults of every kind. But whoever insults the Holy Spirit will never be forgiven. That person is guilty of a sin with consequences that last forever." Jesus said this because the legal experts were saying he's possessed by an evil spirit. His mother and brothers arrived. They stood outside and sent word to him, calling for him. A crowd was seated around him, and those sent to him said, "Look, your mother, brothers, and sisters are outside looking for you." Jesus replied, "Who is my mother? Who are my brothers?" Looking around at those seated around him in a circle, he said, "Look, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother, sister, and mother." The Gospel of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Please be seated. Sometimes there is nothing better than a good Markan sandwich. And you don't even have to go to a deli. You don't have to go to a sandwich shop to get one. In fact, I'm willing to bet all of you have had one at one point if you've hung out and worshiped for any time at all, if you have flipped through the Gospel of Mark, if you maybe attended a Bible study, a Markan sandwich. It's actually a literary technique. Every writer has their ways of conveying their ideas. That's why we have 4 Gospels: Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. 4 different ways to think about who Jesus is, how Jesus works in our lives, how Jesus works throughout creation. And one of Mark's techniques to grabbing our attention and also to widen the lens of how God works and how Jesus moves in our world is to use a particular technique called the sandwich. It's an odd description. It is kind of ridiculous. But in essence what happens, and we have it in our reading, think of a sandwich, 2 pieces of bread, you got some condiments there, maybe your mayo, your ketchup, those sorts of things, and in the middle is the meat. Or if you're a meatless person, well then that's where your veggies or your salad goes. In our reading, at verse 21, we are introduced to Jesus' mother and his family. They've come, they're looking for Jesus, and by the way, they think that he is out of his mind. Which, maybe in street language we would say, they think he's crazy. They think he's off kilter, that he has a mental disease or disorder, so they have come to claim him, to bind him up, based on different translations. They want to grab him, take him out of his context and all these wacky things that he's doing and take him home because they want to care for him. They love him and they're worried about him, so they have come to get him. But then they seem to kind of disappear from the story. Then we go a little deeper and Mark adds a little bit more substance, the condiments, if you will, more flavor. And now we get the religious leaders. Now they have showed up. Now they have come, and they're saying that Jesus is possessed by the devil. And then Jesus has the meat in the middle, this otherwise odd story where Jesus talks about, which makes sense, but it's still kind of odd. Jesus says that Satan's house cannot be divided. If it's divided, it will fall, that sort of thing. And then we have that continuing on statement about how a strong man needs to be bound up first before the thief can break into the house to steal all the stuff. And then we get back to the religious leaders, and then we get back to mom and the siblings. What Mark is trying to help us to do is to widen our imagination of what Jesus is doing out in the world, and to remind us that when Jesus says these words, these curious stories that we have, generally they are probably in context. Jesus is responding directly to his parents, or his mom and his siblings, who seem to think that he's out of his mind. He's responding directly to the religious authorities, who seem to think that he's possessed by the devil because of all these things that he's doing. And he tells us this story about a strong man who needs to be bound up so that the thief can get all the goods. So if Jesus is talking about what it means to be family, and if Jesus is talking about what it means to be church, well then church, this is an opportunity for us to talk about what does it mean to be family. And in the context of this particular story, Jesus is giving us this vision, this idea of what he is up to and how he is setting God's people free. He's setting us free, and beyond that, he is setting free all of these folks who are clamoring in, seeking healing and freedom and liberation, God's people. So we have the context of the family, and we have the context of the church. And all this month, we have our lived context. This month as church, we are acknowledging that this is Pride Month. Pride Month is a month where we can set aside time and set aside opportunities where we can affirm the lives of LGBTQIA people, our people. Some of us know LGBTQ folks. Some of us go to school with LGBTQ folks. Some of us have people in our family. We have kids who identify along orientation or along gender understandings. And Jesus is inviting us to think about family. And Jesus is inviting us to think about church and what it means to be church and what it means to be family in the context of people who are clamoring and longing for good news to hear that they have been created by God and loved by God. So Jesus starts painting a picture. He starts telling us, and of course he's responding to the church and or the religious authorities, but we'll just say church, and he's responding to his family by saying that a house divided will fall. Your translation may have that particular phrase. And we know that, and that in part makes sense, but then we have this odd second piece about the strong man being bound up and the thief coming in and rummaging around the house to gather out all the goods. And another way to think about that in the context of church, and a way to think about in the context of family, that maybe Jesus is the thief. And maybe Jesus isn't coming to steal anything. Maybe what Jesus is coming to do is to take back what belongs to God. We know how we are bound in our sin. We confess it every week. We will confess it soon in this particular worship service. We know how we get so bound up in our sin that at times we will even then bind up our neighbors, our loved ones, our spouses, our kids in our sin. So when Jesus starts talking about a strong man that needs to be bound up, Jesus is talking about interfering on our behalf and setting us free and then setting free our neighbors. And because we are in this context of pride, Jesus is also helping us to remember that our words, just like his mother's words, just like the religious leader's words, our words have impact. Our words can bind up. Just a couple of quick examples. There's an organization called the Trevor Project. They are an LGBTQ advocacy group. They work on behalf of specifically youth, but they work for adults as well. But they did this huge project. Many thousands of people were interviewed, LGBTQ youth. They released this research in 2019, and they found that 1.8 million LGBTQ youth contemplate suicide every year. Nearly 2 million young people have convinced themselves that their lives are worth less, or maybe worth nothing at all, that they are truly better off dead because of their identity and because of their gender, that they contemplate suicide every year. But here's another fact. As we start thinking about and widening our vision of what it means to be family, knowing that it's not just bloodlines and genealogies and trees and roots, because sometimes some of us get cut off from our roots. The Trevor Project found that one adult, not one grandma, not one grandpa, not one auntie or uncle, not one cousin, one adult who is safe in the life of that LGBTQ youth reduces the risk of suicide by 40%. One person speaking love. One person speaking grace. One person speaking of affirmation and joy and God's presence in the life of others. We know the impact of our words, and we know how we as church, we know as God's people, because we are bound up in our sin, we see it in our broader culture, how our sin binding ourselves, we will then bind up others and keep others from moving. We will silence, we will cast out, we will cast off, we will kick out of community those who don't fit. We're seeing it all across our country. This year, there are 250 different bills that are being considered that are specifically anti-LGBTQ people. There's 8 bills that were passed in different states that are specifically anti-trans. There are 4 bills that have been passed. These are now state law. That if you had that great sandwich shop where you're making that awesome Markin sandwich, if someone who comes in with a pride flag, you don't have to give them anything at all. And there's 2 states where it is perfectly legal for you to not just deny them the sandwich, but to also discriminate actively against them, shrouded in religious belief. Church, our words have impact. Our family has impact. Who we are and how we walk in this world, it has impact not just for us, but for all of creation. And Jesus is responding to family, Jesus is responding to church, and Jesus is reminding us how he is moving against Satan and the very powers of this world to unbind God's people. Such an odd story, this idea of a thief breaking into somebody's house, binding up the strong man, and then stealing all the stuff. It's such a different way to think about how God works in this world. And again, Jesus widening our vision. And by the way, we actually confess this story. We're about to confess it in just a couple of minutes in the Apostles' Creed, the second article, where we say that Jesus descended into hell, or sometimes we'll say Jesus descended into the dead. What is Jesus doing in hell? Why did Jesus go amongst the dead? He went there to set us free, to set you free, to cut us free, to cut us from the binds of sin and death. Jesus moves in to the house to set us free, to set our neighbors free, to set our family free, to set our co-workers free, to set our classmates free, to set us free, to help us to know that God's grace reaches to every person in creation. Jesus moves in, binds up all the powers of this world, sets them to death, and gives us life. Jesus moves on the behalf of all who have been silenced. Jesus moves on the behalf of all who have been cast out. And Jesus then comes to us, church, widening our vision of family, widening our vision of who we can be. And then he sends us out. It's a little bit why we have the flags along the sidewalks out there. It's a small thing. It's a very, very little thing. But it's a way for us to speak of God's love and God's grace for our community, for our neighbors. And I want to tell you, friends, our neighbors see it. And yes, there are folks who are grumpy and there are those who are grumbling. And yeah, some of them have now called me. But I've also been called by families who say thank you. Because there are so few spaces and places where our people, our youth, can know that they are loved, and that they are worthy of God's grace just like every other person created by God. Jesus is sending us out, and Jesus has already done the work. We're post-resurrection people. Jesus has already died, descended, and on the third day rose again. We are set free. We are liberated as God's people to head out through the doors and to proclaim the liberation that Christ is already offering to all of God's people. Jesus widening our vision, Jesus opening us up to imagine what we can do and how our words could unbind others through Christ's power. Jesus is saying and doing all of this in the context of family and in the context of church, so that we, church, we can imagine again what it means to be family, especially for those who have been cut off from their own. Amen.